In a quiet Colorado town, nobody expected a tiny raccoon to stop traffic, tug at a police officer's boot, and lead her straight into the stormy woods. What began as mischief turned into a life-or-death rescue, where loyalty from the most unlikely creature brought tears to everyone's eyes, and forever changed the fate of a town. The afternoon heat in Maplewood sat heavy over the valley, turning the two-lane blacktop into a wavering ribbon of light. Traffic drifted to a stop, the way snow settles on a fence, slow, puzzled, almost polite. Drivers leaned out windows, hands lifted in that universal question: what now? At the head of the line, by the town's metal welcome sign and a dented green trash can, a little raccoon stood on its hind legs as if it owned the place. It wasn't just standing, it was working the scene. The animal strutted to the center line, lifted its nose like a tiny foreman, then slapped both front paws on the yellow paint, as if to order everything to halt. When a pickup rolled forward, the raccoon hurried to the bumper and peered at its reflection. Then it scurried back to the trash can, climbed the side, and banged the lid with a quick drum roll of claws that made two teenagers laugh and an older woman cross herself. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to be the one to clip a wild thing with big eyes and hands too much like a child's. The first siren whooped low and rounded the curve. Officer Emily Carter eased her cruiser onto the shoulder, light bar throwing blue onto the cottonwoods. She had been a patrol officer for 2 years, long enough to know most of Maplewood's dogs by their collars and most of its arguments by sound. Wild animals usually ran at the first hum of an engine. This one stayed, squared up, and stared at her like she was late. Emily stepped out and felt the day press at her back. The air smelled like sun-warmed pine and hot brakes. "All right, little guy," she said, not loudly, palms open, voice even. "Road's not a good place to make friends." The raccoon blinked, then did something she hadn't seen in any of the training videos. It trotted straight to the cruiser, rose up, and tapped both front paws against the driver's door. Tap, 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 tap. A rhythm, not a panic. It held her eyes through the glass, then looked past her at the line of cars, then back at her, as if waiting for her to catch up. A man in an oil-stained baseball cap called from a minivan. "Ma'am, I think it's rabid." His wife hissed at him to hush. A boy in the back seat pressed a cracker through a crack in the window. The raccoon flicked an ear, unimpressed, and went on tapping. Emily circled the hood, holster snug against her hip, and took in the details the way her field training officer had drilled into her. The animal was small, this year's baby, maybe, ribs faint under the fur but eyes bright. Its whiskers were dusty, its paws were clean, no limp, no wet spots, no froth at the mouth, no glassy stare, and around one hind leg just above the ankle, something that didn't belong, a thin strip of red cloth, tied in a clumsy knot that had frayed into tassels. She felt the first tug of unease. Wild things sometimes wore scars. They didn't usually wear ribbons. A garbage truck idled halfway back, diesel throbbing. The driver hung out the window. "Want me to swing this can into the hopper? Little bandit's been at it all morning." "Hold off," Emily said, lifting a hand. "Let me clear the lane first." The raccoon scurried to the trash can and, with a flourish, shouldered the lid open, dove to its shoulders, and came up with a crinkled fast food bag, like a magician pulling a scarf. Then, with a quick look at Emily, it stuffed the bag back down, decisively, as if to say, "That's not what I'm here for." It hopped to the ground and trotted to the center line again, then back to her boots, chittering softly, a sound that carried a note too close to speech. "Okay," Emily murmured. "You're not hungry. You're What are you? A sedan door opened with a creak. Mrs. Agnes Doolin from the church quilting circle shuffled out with the help of a cane. "Officer Carter," she called, "that little rascal's been circling my porch the last 2 mornings, bold as brass. I told Arnie, that's no ordinary coon. It looks at you, not past you, at you." "Please stay by your car, Ms. Doolin," Emily said gently. She keyed her shoulder mic. "Dispatch, Unit 12 on Maplewood East. We've got a juvenile raccoon in the roadway. Unusual behavior. Stand by." The raccoon brushed the tip of her boot with one paw. A touch, light as static. Then it trotted 3 paces toward the tree line, stopped, twisted back to make sure she was watching, and chittered again. The red strip on its leg flashed like a flag. Tap-tap went its paw on the asphalt. 3 paces. Look back. Tap-tap. It wasn't random. It was a pattern, a breadcrumb trail made of sound. A white SUV slid in behind the cruiser, and Mark Johnson climbed out. Broad shoulders, firehouse t-shirt, sunburned neck, and the calm that never left him, even at 2 in the morning when the batteries in a smoke alarm decided to cry. "Heard you had a traffic snarl," he called. "Heard you also had a celebrity." "Depends who you ask," Emily said. "He's got a bracelet." Mark squinted. "That's cloth. Somebody tied that. You thinking backyard pet?" "I'm thinking somebody wanted him noticed." She nodded toward the trees. "And I'm thinking he wants us to follow." Before Mark could answer, a second car door shut, and a woman jogged up, dark hair in a braid, medical bag bumping her hip. Lisa Gomez worked the morning shift at the clinic and the evening ones when someone was born early or late. She took one look and shook her head. "He's not stumbling. Gait looks clean. No foam, no head tilt. Not rabies today." "Look at this," Emily said quietly. The raccoon had come back to her foot and pressed its cheek into the leather, then lifted the tied leg, paws splayed, as if showing off a scuffed knee to a school nurse. The knot was simple, tugged tight by hands that had been in a hurry. "Lord," Lisa whispered, "that's not an accident. Someone marked him." The line of cars had gone silent in the way a church does when the doors close and the service begins. People leaned forward in their seats, windows down, faces open to the oddness of it. The wind shifted, and the cottonwoods made a soft river sound. In the far distance, thunder grumbled, a leftover from last night's mountain storm. The raccoon glanced at the clouds, then at Emily, and shuffled from paw to paw as if time had become a worry it could count. "All right," Emily said, the decision forming in her chest before her mind quite agreed. She could feel every lecture she'd ever heard about wild animals and traffic and human danger line up like road signs. She could also feel a small, unmistakable push that didn't come from any manual. "Let's move these cars to the shoulder. Keep folks back. Then we see where he takes us." Mark nodded, peeled off to wave drivers around. Lisa lifted a hand for the crowd to stay behind the white line. Emily clicked the mic again. "Dispatch, be advised. We're going to follow an animal off the roadway. Please notify Parks and send a unit to manage traffic at Maplewood East. Potential welfare check in the woods. We'll maintain radio contact." "Copy, Unit 12, the speaker crackled. "Advise if you need search and rescue." The raccoon, having apparently heard and approved, scampered to the first white stripe, waited, then darted across to the shoulder with a confidence that made Emily swallow. He paused, peered through the grass, and trotted toward the shadow under the trees. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back, wide-eyed, impatient, the way a child does when a grown-up takes too long to tie a shoe. "Hold on," Emily told him, and immediately felt foolish for talking like he could understand. The little head cocked. The strip of red lifted and fell with his steps, a metronome for her pulse. She stepped off the asphalt. The first foot into the grass let go of the day's heat. The second foot brought the smells that live under shade. Wet earth, crushed juniper, a stale sweetness like old apples. Behind her, engines idled, but beyond the cottonwoods the world drew tight and quiet, as if it had been waiting for her to step through. The raccoon vanished into the green, then reappeared on a fallen log, sat and washed its face with quick, fussy motions that made a little girl in the back of a station wagon clap her hands. It finished washing, hopped down, and hustled deeper, tail ringed like a barber pole swishing with purpose. "Carter," Mark said softly at her shoulder, "you're really going to let a raccoon set your route?" "I'm going to see what he's pointing at," she said. "If he's been on someone's porch 2 mornings in a row, and now he's stopping traffic, there's a reason. We don't have to go far." Lisa caught up and pressed a small flashlight into Emily's palm. "In case the canopy gets thick. And take this." She tucked a foil packet into Emily's vest pocket. "Sugar gel, for him or you." The raccoon led them to the edge of a narrow path where the weeds bent as if something heavier than the wind had passed. He stopped, placed both paws on the dirt, and scraped a shallow line. Then another, crossing the first, a clumsy X, sketched with patience. Emily knelt. The soil was still damp from the storm. The top layer lifted easily, and under it she saw a shine where there should have been brown. A sliver of broken glass, the corner of a phone case. The glass was spidered with cracks. A smear of something dark had dried along the edge and turned rusty. She looked up. The raccoon watched her steadily, chest heaving a little, sides moving with breath. It took 2 steps back into the trees, then paused for her to follow, the way it had on the road. It didn't blink. Behind them, a horn bleated once, far away and already unimportant. Emily stood, closed her hand around the tiny flashlight, felt the packet of sugar crinkle in her pocket, and fixed her eyes on the flicker of red at the small animal's ankle. "Okay," she said, to Mark, to Lisa, to the quiet under the trees, and maybe to the older woman in the sedan, still praying under her breath. "We're coming." The raccoon turned and slipped into the shade, a small striped tail drawing a line through the grass as neat as a finger on a map. Emily stepped after it, and the town fell away behind her. The shadows closed in around them as the 3 of them left the roadway behind. The raccoon scuttled ahead, pausing every few yards to be sure they followed, then darted forward again. Emily could hear the shuffle of Mark's boots on the pine needles behind her, and the softer tread of Lisa's sneakers. The air was cooler under the trees, still heavy, but easier to breathe, filled with the smell of damp wood and moss. A jay shrieked somewhere above, then fell silent, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Crazy thing is leading us, like he knows exactly where to go," Mark muttered, though his voice carried a note of respect more than disbelief. "Most critters see us and scatter." "This one's different," Emily said. Her hand brushed the mic clipped to her vest. "Dispatch, Unit 12. We've left the highway, following the animal east into the woods. Still together, 3 personnel on foot." The reply crackled faintly. "Copy that. Keep us updated." The raccoon stopped beside a stump and sat back on its haunches, washing its face with brisk strokes of its little hands. It looked absurdly domestic, like a child caught in mischief. Then, without warning, it scurried toward the stump's hollow, tugged out a wad of damp napkins, and tossed them aside. From deeper inside it fished out something harder, a crushed aluminum can, which it dropped at Emily's boots with a clatter. The small bandit chittered impatiently, then darted a few steps farther down the trail. "He's showing off," Lisa said softly. "But not for food. That's deliberate." Emily crouched to study the can. The metal was dented, streaked with mud, and smeared with a trace of something darker, sticky and dried. She didn't say it aloud, but Lisa bent lower, her brow furrowed. "That's blood," she whispered. Mark blew out a breath through his nose. "Well, hell." The raccoon darted back, tugged at the hem of Emily's pant leg with one paw, then released her and scampered onward. The red cloth around its ankle flickered like a flag in the shifting light. They pushed deeper. Roots crossed the path like bones. Branches snagged on Emily's sleeves. Twice she heard the shuffle of a car pulling away out on the highway, faint reminders of the world they'd left behind. Here the silence was thick, broken only by the rustle of the raccoon and the creak of their own breathing. After 10 minutes, the little creature halted again. It perched on a rock and bobbed its head toward the underbrush. Emily followed its gaze and spotted a torn strap caught in the low branches, the kind that might have belonged to a backpack. A few steps farther, a clear plastic bottle lay on its side, still half filled with cloudy water. The cap was missing. Lisa bent to pick it up, held it up to the light, then wrinkled her nose. "This hasn't been here long. It's still cool from the shade." Emily felt the hairs along her neck stand on end. She touched her radio again. "Dispatch, Unit 12. We may have a missing person situation. Found personal items off Maplewood East Trail. Requesting search and rescue on standby." "Copy that, Unit 12. Logging as potential welfare check. Nearest SR unit is 30 minutes out." The raccoon yipped softly, then hopped from the rock and led them on. His little body weaved between saplings, tail swinging like a lantern. At one point, he veered toward a fallen log, clambered up, and began pawing frantically at the bark. Mark hurried forward and heaved the log aside. Beneath it lay a cell phone, screen shattered but faintly glowing with a blinking notification light. Emily knelt, brushing dirt away from the cracked glass. She pressed the button and the screen lit with a spiderweb of cracks. But one thing was clear: a list of missed calls, dozens of them, all time stamped through the night. The name that repeated was "Daughter." "Someone out here tried to reach help," Emily said quietly. The raccoon tilted its head, as though urging her to connect the dots. Then it bounded a few feet, paused, and gave another sharp chitter. Mark looked at Emily, his jaw tight. "We're not chasing ghosts, Carter. Somebody's in trouble." She nodded once. "And he knows where." They moved on, the forest darkening as clouds rolled overhead. A gust of wind brought the smell of wet bark and the promise of more rain. Emily caught herself watching the raccoon more than the trail. How he never strayed too far, how he paused to make sure they were close, how he would scratch a line in the dirt with his paws, like he was underlining a message only he could write. At one point, he darted toward a cluster of mushrooms, snuffled at them, then scampered back to Emily, with his nose dusted white. Mark chuckled under his breath, a sound that broke the tension for half a heartbeat. Guess he's got a sense of humor, too. But the levity didn't last. 100 yards farther on, they came to a break in the trees, where the ground dipped into a shallow gully. There, scattered among the stones, lay more personal items: a torn flannel shirt, a crumpled paper map with rain stains bleeding the ink, and worst of all, a smear of dried blood across the rocks leading up toward the ridge. Lisa knelt, gloved hand hovering just above the stain. "Not animal. This is human." Her voice wavered just enough to tighten Emily's chest. The raccoon stood on the ridge above them, tiny silhouette against the gray sky. It stamped its front paws twice, then sat back and lifted its banded tail high, as though declaring the next stage of their journey. Emily exhaled slowly, a knot hard in her throat. the little creature's black eyes locked on hers, full of urgency. She knew in that moment that this wasn't a detour, not a chance encounter. This was a call for help, as real as any she'd ever answered on her radio. She turned to Mark and Lisa. "We keep going. Someone's alive out here, and he's not going to let us stop until we find them." The raccoon rose, gave a quick shake as though dusting off his determination, and vanished into the thickening shadows. Emily stepped after him, her heart pounding louder than the thunder rolling closer from the mountains. The forest swallowed them whole, and the trail ahead promised more than just mystery. It promised a reckoning. The rain had not yet started, but the sky above the trees had turned the color of old pewter. Emily felt the pressure of weather coming, the hush that made animals skittish and people thoughtful. The raccoon, however, showed no fear. He moved with a strange confidence, his striped tail lifting like a guide's flag, his eyes flashing back every so often to be sure they were still behind him. Emily pushed a branch out of her way and let it snap back after Mark had passed. Lisa kept close, her medical bag bouncing lightly against her hip. Each of them was quiet now, listening more than speaking, letting the sounds of the woods guide their steps. The crunch of pine needles, the faint scrape of boots on rock, the constant scurrying of their unlikely companion. It all pressed together into a rhythm that pulled them deeper. "He's not wandering," Mark muttered at last. "He's leading." Emily nodded, her jaw tight. "He hasn't strayed once." The trail narrowed and forced them into single file. At one point, the raccoon hopped up onto a fallen log, scampered along it, then paused at the end and tapped his paws against the bark, quick and sharp. Emily's eyes followed the gesture to the ground beyond. There, half buried in leaves, was the crumpled corner of a paper map. She picked it up carefully. The ink had bled into blue and brown stains, but she could still make out the word Maplewood and the faint line of the state park boundary. "Somebody brought this in," Emily said softly, "and they didn't take it back out." Lisa's voice was gentle, but it carried weight. "If he's been circling the highway 2 mornings in a row, maybe he's been trying to get anyone to follow." The raccoon gave a small grunt, then bounded into the brush again. The forest thickened until the light seemed to turn green. Roots twisted across the ground like ropes. Emily nearly stumbled twice but caught herself on nearby branches. Mark's heavy frame moved steadily, but even he had to pause to step over the snags. Lisa huffed lightly, but she never complained. The raccoon scrambled ahead to a cluster of rocks that formed a natural wall. He climbed quickly, then disappeared over the other side. Emily scrambled up after him, boots slipping on wet stone, and pulled herself onto the crest. Her breath caught. Below them stretched a small hollow, shaded by leaning pines. In the center of it lay a weathered cabin, its roof sagging, and one side caved in. Boards hung loose, blackened where lightning had kissed them. A smell of mildew and damp wood clung to the clearing. The raccoon sat on the cabin's broken porch as though it were his throne. He lifted his paws, rubbed them together, then let out a sound that was too insistent to be dismissed as random. Mark whistled low. "Looks like the old hunting shack. Thought it had been abandoned for years." Emily's pulse quickened. She had driven past this ridge on patrol a dozen times, but had never thought anyone lived here. She slipped carefully down the incline, boots crunching on gravel, and approached the door frame where the wood had splintered. The raccoon darted inside, tail vanishing into the shadows. Emily followed, one hand on her flashlight. Inside, the air was cooler, damp, tinged with the metallic smell of rust or blood. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. A cot sagged in the corner, the blankets damp and mouldy. Then she heard it. A faint groan, the sound of breath drawn with pain. "Over here," Lisa called, already moving toward a dark corner near the collapsed wall. They found him pinned beneath a beam, his grey beard matted with dirt, his skin pale. His flannel shirt was torn, his leg twisted under the weight of timber. He opened his eyes slowly, squinting against the flashlight. The raccoon scampered onto his chest, pressing its little paws against him, chittering softly, as if reassuring him that the help he'd brought had arrived. Emily knelt down beside the man. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm Officer Carter. You're not alone anymore." His lips moved, dry and cracked. The sound came faint but clear enough. "Rusty, good boy." His hand lifted weakly to brush against the raccoon's back. The small animal pressed its head into his chest with a tender stubbornness that made Emily's throat tighten. She felt heat sting her eyes as the truth hit with the force of a hammer. This wasn't some stray scavenger looking for trash. This raccoon had gone to the road on purpose. He had found her on purpose, and he had brought them to the man he loved. Emily swallowed hard, blinking the blur from her vision. The tears surprised her, but she let them fall, because there, in that ruined shack, under the storm-heavy sky, she understood. The little creature had carried a message more powerful than any siren or radio call. It had refused to give up until someone listened. Lisa pressed a hand gently to the man's chest, listening to his breath. "He's alive. Weak but alive. We need to move fast." Mark braced himself against the beam, testing its weight. "This isn't going to be easy." The raccoon scrambled back down to the man's leg, sniffing at the knot of red cloth tied around its own ankle, then pawing at the trapped limb, as though pointing them toward the problem. Emily reached out and stroked the fur between its ears, her voice breaking. "You did it, little one. You saved him." The raccoon looked up at her, eyes shining in the gloom, and for a moment she could have sworn it understood every word. Rain began to patter against the sagging roof as Emily crouched low beside the old man. The cabin smelled of damp earth, smoke, and time. The broken walls groaned with every gust of wind, threatening to collapse further. The raccoon, Rusty, stayed planted on the man's chest, as though guarding him from the storm. His little paws kneaded gently against the man's shirt, and his black eyes never left Emily's face. "Sir, stay with me," Emily urged softly. "We've got help coming." The man's breath rattled, uneven and shallow. "Name's Thomas Miller," he whispered, the words like sandpaper on his throat. "Legs gone bad. Been here since yesterday. Thought I'd be gone by now." His hand trembled as he tried to pet the raccoon's head. But Rusty wouldn't leave. Emily felt her heart squeeze tight. The image of this little animal running across the highway, pawing at her boots, refusing to give up. It all suddenly snapped into place. He hadn't been confused. He had been determined. Lisa knelt at Miller's side, pulling medical supplies from her bag. "Compound fracture, maybe worse," she muttered. "He's dehydrated. Pulse is weak." She offered him a sip from her canteen, careful to support his head. He coughed, but swallowed, his pale lips wetting just enough to make speech easier. Mark braced himself against the heavy beam pinning Miller's leg. He tested the weight, his shoulders straining. "This isn't budging without leverage." "Cabin's ready to come down around us if I push too hard." The raccoon scrambled down from Miller's chest, and pawed furiously at the beam, chittering as though demanding Mark try harder. The sight might have been funny under different circumstances, the little creature so small against the heavy wood. But here, in the half-dark, it was heartbreaking. "Easy, boy," Emily whispered, laying a calming hand on Rusty's back. She looked at Miller. "How long has he been with you?" The old man managed a faint smile, though pain wrinkled his forehead. "Found him near the river last spring. His mother got hit on the road. I couldn't leave him. Hand-fed him until he was strong. Knew he'd never be completely wild after that. But I taught him what I could. Taught him roads meant people. People meant help." His eyes filled with tears. "When the storm came, this roof gave way. Leg-trapped. I tied that cloth on him. Told him to go find someone. Didn't know if he would." His gaze shifted to Emily, wet with gratitude. "But he found you." Emily swallowed hard. She could feel tears stinging at her own eyes. "He did," she whispered. "He did better than most people would." A loud creak echoed overhead as the roof shifted. Dust and bits of bark rained down. Mark shot a glance upward. "We don't have much time. This whole thing's gonna cave." Lisa pressed gauze against Miller's leg to slow the bleeding. "If we don't free him soon, the leg's gone, or worse." Emily keyed her radio. "Dispatch Unit 12. We've located an injured male, approximately 62 years old, trapped under debris in the old ridge cabin. He's alive but critical. We need search and rescue with extraction gear immediately." "Copy that, Unit 12. The radio crackled. "Rescue ETA 25 minutes. Hold tight." 25 minutes felt like a lifetime. Rusty paced frantically now, darting between Emily, Mark, and the old man, squealing sharp notes of panic. At one point he even leapt onto Emily's shoulder, tugging at the strap of her vest as though to say, "Do something now." Emily steadied him with one hand. "I know, Rusty. We're trying." Mark's eyes swept the cabin. "We can use that." He pointed to a broken support beam leaning against the far wall. "Leverage." Together he and Emily dragged it into place. The Raccoon scurried alongside, tugging uselessly at the splinters as if part of the team. Mark wedged the beam under the collapsed timber. "On 3, he said, sweat already dripping down his temples. Emily braced beside him. 1, 2, 3. They heaved. The beam groaned, the timbers shifted, dust exploded into the air. Miller cried out, the sound jagged with pain, but his leg began to slide free. Lisa darted in, pulling him clear as Mark gave one final push. The heavy timber slammed back down with a crash that shook the entire cabin. Rusty let out a squeal and bolted up Emily's leg, clinging to her shoulder. His tiny claws dug through her jacket, but she let him stay, her own chest heaving. They had him free, but the roof gave another ominous crack. "We've got to move," Mark barked. Lisa wrapped Miller's leg with a makeshift splint. "He can't walk. We'll have to carry him." "I'll take him," Mark said, crouching down. Emily and Lisa helped lift Miller onto his back. The old man groaned, but he clung weakly to Rusty, who scrambled down to nestle against his chest once more. "Good boy," Miller whispered, pressing his lips against the raccoon's fur. Emily led the way out, flashlight cutting through the gloom. As they stumbled into the clearing, the first fat drops of rain began to fall in earnest. Behind them, with a final groan, the old cabin gave up its fight. The roof caved inward, sending a cloud of dust and splinters billowing into the air. They all froze for a moment, staring back at the ruin. If they had waited even a few more minutes, Miller would have been buried alive. The raccoon pressed closer to his chest, and Miller began to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears of relief as his fingers clung to the little animal's fur. Emily felt her own throat tighten, the emotion swelling too thick to push back. Lisa pressed her hand against Emily's arm, her voice hushed. "If that little one hadn't gone to the road." Emily nodded, her eyes wet. "We'd never have found him." The storm opened up above them, rain slashing through the trees. Mark adjusted his grip on Miller and started toward the trail. Emily walked beside them, Rusty perched like a sentinel against the man's chest. Every so often the raccoon would glance back at her, his black eyes shining with something more than instinct, something that felt almost like trust. As the forest closed around them and thunder rumbled overhead, Emily whispered under her breath, not sure if she was speaking to the old man, the raccoon, or herself. "You've done more than find help, little one. You've reminded us what loyalty looks like." Rusty blinked slowly, rain dripping from his whiskers, and gave a soft, satisfied chitter. It was the sound of a promise kept. And as they made their way back through the storm, Emily knew she would never forget the sight of that ragged little raccoon, stubborn and brave, who refused to let the world ignore him. The rain came in sheets now, drumming against leaves and pooling in the hollows of the trail. Emily led the way, her flashlight beam cutting a pale ribbon through the grey curtain. Mark trudged behind her, his big frame bent forward beneath the weight of Thomas Miller. Lisa stayed close at his side, checking his pulse and murmuring encouragement that he might not have even heard. Rusty clung stubbornly to the old man's chest, soaked to the skin, his fur plastered into spiky ridges. Yet he refused to move, his little black hands gripping Miller's torn flannel, as if holding him together. They had made it only a few hundred yards from the cabin when thunder cracked overhead like a cannon blast. Emily froze for a moment, scanning the dark line of trees. The world smelled of wet bark and iron. "We'll make for the ridge clearing," she shouted over the storm. "It's higher ground. Rescue will find us faster there." Mark grunted in agreement and shifted Miller's weight. The old man groaned, his head lolling weakly against Mark's shoulder. Lisa steadied him. "Stay with us, Mr. Miller. You're not out of the woods yet." Miller coughed, a harsh sound swallowed quickly by the rain. His lips moved, and for a moment, Emily thought he was too weak to speak. But then the words came, ragged and halting. "Rusty, he didn't just find me. He saved me." Emily slowed her steps and looked back. Miller's eyes were glassy, but determination flickered there. His hand moved, searching until it found Rusty's small body. The raccoon pressed into his palm, eyes bright even through the rain. "I raised him from a pup," Miller rasped. "Fed him with bottles, kept him close. Folks told me I was a fool, said you can't tame wild. But I didn't want to tame him. I wanted him to survive. Taught him roads meant people. People meant help. Told him, if I was ever in trouble, he had to bring someone." He swallowed hard, voice catching. "And that's what he did. He wouldn't leave. He just wouldn't." Rusty let out a soft whimper, curling tighter against his chest. Emily's throat ached. She could picture the stubborn little creature pawing at her boots on the highway, refusing to let her walk away. It hadn't been mischief. It had been a mission. Lightning forked through the sky, bathing the forest in white light for a heartbeat. When the thunder followed, it rattled the ground beneath their boots. Mark quickened his pace. "This ridge better show up soon, Carter. or I'll be carrying all of us." "We're close," Emily said, her voice firm, though her chest was tight with fear. She knew Mark was right. If they didn't reach open ground before the storm worsened, search and rescue might never find them. Lisa adjusted the splint around Miller's leg, her hands steady despite the downpour. "He's fading, Emily. We need to keep him awake." Emily turned back to the old man, forcing her voice loud enough to cut through the storm. "Mr. Miller, tell me more about Rusty. How did you find him?" The question seemed to spark something in him. His eyes flickered open wider. "His mother, killed by a truck near the river. He was small enough to fit in my pocket. Couldn't even climb yet. I kept him in a box by the stove. He chewed the buttons off my shirts, raided the sugar jar when I turned my back. Mischief in fur." His cracked lips twitched in a faint smile. "But clever. Always clever." Rusty gave a sudden squeak, as if offended by being called mischief, then promptly reached out and tugged at Lisa's braid. She gasped, half startled, half amused, and swatted him gently away. Even in the worst moment, his antics broke through the terror, pulling a shaky laugh from Mark. "See?" Miller murmured, his voice fading softer. "He knows when you need it. He knows." The trail steepened, slick with mud. Emily braced herself against a tree and pulled Lisa forward. Together they guided Mark and his burden up the incline. At the top, the trees parted into a wide clearing. The grass bent low beneath the storm. Emily keyed her radio. "Dispatch Unit 12. We've reached open ground near the East Ridge. We've got the subject male, injured leg, weak vitals, holding position for extraction." "Copy?" Static crackled, then the blessed voice of dispatch broke through. "Copy, Unit 12, helicopter en route, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. They settled Miller onto the wet grass. Lisa knelt beside him, shielding his face with her jacket. Rusty refused to leave his chest, water dripping from his whiskers, his small body shivering but resolute. Miller turned his head toward Emily. Rain streaked his weathered face, blending with the tears in his eyes. "Don't ever doubt him," he whispered. "He's more than wild. He's family." Emily felt her own tears mingle with the rain. She had seen loyalty in dogs, devotion in people, but never in a creature most folks only thought of as a nuisance in the trash. Rusty was something else, a bridge between worlds, stubborn enough to fight the odds, tender enough to save the man who had saved him. Thunder roared again, but Emily barely heard it. She reached out, resting her hand gently on the raccoon's sodden back. "You did good, Rusty," she murmured. "You did better than good." The raccoon lifted his head, eyes glowing dark and steady. In that moment, with the storm raging around them and the old man's life hanging by a thread, Emily felt something she couldn't explain. A bond, sharp and undeniable, that left her breathless. She realized then why the tears had come so quickly when she first saw the cloth on his leg. She hadn't just recognized a cry for help. She had recognized devotion. Above them, the thrum of helicopter blades began to echo through the rain. Rescue was on the way. Emily pressed her palm against the raccoon's back once more, whispering to him over the storm, "Hold on. We're almost there." Rusty settled back against Miller's chest, closing his eyes as if he finally allowed himself a moment of rest. And for the first time since she'd stepped out of her cruiser that afternoon, Emily believed they might all make it out alive. The storm hammered down, as if the sky itself wanted to keep them trapped on that ridge. The grass clung wet and heavy to their legs, the trees bent and swayed like weary men fighting the wind. Emily crouched low beside Thomas Miller, shielding his face as best she could from the rain. Mark knelt on the other side, his shoulders squared, and his breath coming in harsh, steady pulls. Lisa's hands worked quickly, tightening the splint, checking pulse, whispering words of comfort that might have been more for herself than for him. Rusty never left Miller's chest. His tiny frame shook with the cold, his fur matted to his skin, but his eyes blazed with stubborn fire. Every time Miller groaned, Rusty pressed closer, pawing at his shirt as if to remind him he wasn't alone. Emily couldn't help but marvel. She had seen dogs guard their masters, seen cats curl against the dying, but never had she seen such fierce loyalty in something the town had always dismissed as a nuisance animal. The radio hissed in Emily's hand, then the dispatcher's voice cut through the static. Unit 12, helicopter delayed, visibility worsening. Ground crew mobilized from Maplewood Station, ETA 30 minutes. Emily's stomach dropped. 30 minutes. She looked at Miller, skin pale as the clouds above, lips trembling from the cold. His breath was shallow, uneven. She turned toward Lisa, who shook her head grimly. He doesn't have 30 minutes without warmth. He's bleeding inside somewhere. If we don't keep him conscious, we'll lose him. Mark set his jaw, rain sliding down the hard line of his cheek. Then we keep him here and alive, no matter what it takes. Miller stirred faintly, his voice a raspy whisper. Leave me. Save yourselves. Not a chance, Emily said firmly, leaning close so he could hear her over the storm. You're coming out of this. Rusty didn't bring us this far to watch you quit. At the sound of his name, the raccoon perked up and made a sharp, chittering sound, almost scolding. He scrambled up to Miller's collar, pawed at his chin, then licked his cheek with quick, insistent strokes. Miller's cracked lips twisted into the barest shadow of a smile. Persistent little devil, he murmured. Emily felt her throat burn, but she forced herself steady. That's right. He's not letting go, and neither are we. Mark scanned the clearing. We need cover. Trees won't hold if the wind shifts. That rock face there. He pointed to a shallow overhang along the ridge. If we can get him under it, he'll be out of the rain. Might buy us time. Together, they lifted Miller carefully, Emily holding his shoulders while Mark bore most of the weight. Lisa guided the splinted leg, keeping it from twisting. Rusty refused to be displaced. He climbed up onto Miller's chest, glaring at anyone who tried to shift him aside. It took agonizing minutes, each step slick with mud, but finally they reached the stone overhang. The shelter was crude, barely enough to shield them from the worst of the downpour, but it was something. They lowered Miller gently onto the ground. Rusty hopped off long enough to scratch at the dirt, circling as if arranging a nest, then promptly curled back against him. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed instantly by thunder that made the ground shudder. Lisa flinched, then went right back to checking vitals. He's weak, but he's still with us. Miller's eyes fluttered open. He fixed them on Emily, voice no louder than the rain dripping from the rocks above. I thought I'd die alone in that cabin. But he wouldn't leave me. He just kept pawing at the door, like he knew. I tied the cloth on him, prayed someone would notice. I never thought. His words trailed off. Tears slipped down the grooves of his face, mixing with the rain. Never thought anyone would listen. Emily brushed the wet hair from her forehead and shook her head. I almost didn't. I almost called animal control and moved on, but he wouldn't let me. He kept pushing. You raised him to believe people could help, and he made me believe it too. For a long moment, the only sound was the storm. Then Miller gave a weak chuckle. Smartest thing I ever did was trust that raccoon. Rusty, as if on cue, nipped gently at Miller's sleeve and tugged until Miller looked down at him. Then the little animal curled into a ball, his body heat pressed firmly to the old man's ribs. Mark shifted, restless. "Carter, if the ground crew can't make it in time, we might have to move him ourselves." Emily met his eyes. "And risk killing him on the way?" "Risk's already here," Mark said flatly. "This ridge won't hold if the storm worsens. You felt how that cabin went. Ground soaked through." Lisa cut in, her voice sharp. "We can't drag him. That leg. He'll bleed out before we get halfway." The argument died when Miller coughed violently, his whole body racked with the effort. Rusty squealed, climbing frantically toward his throat as if to protect him. Emily leaned close, steadying him. "Breathe, Mr. Miller. Stay with us. Please." He forced air back into his lungs, then whispered, "Don't blame yourselves. If I don't make it, just remember, he tried. Rusty tried harder than anyone ever has for me." His eyes closed, his lips barely moving. "He's family. Don't let them take him away." Emily's chest ached. She reached for his hand and held it tight. "You're not going anywhere, and neither is he. You have my word." The storm raged on, but above it came another sound. Faint, distant, the hum of engines fighting their way up the mountain road. Emily snapped her head up, hope sparking through her exhaustion. She keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. We hear vehicles. Confirm ground crew approaching." "Copy, Unit 12, came the reply. "Rescue team on site within 10 minutes. Hold position." Emily let out a long, shaking breath. 10 minutes. She looked down at Rusty, still pressed firmly against the man's chest, his little body trembling but his eyes blazing with defiance. "You did it, Rusty," she whispered. "You bought him the time he needed." The raccoon blinked slowly, then nuzzled Miller's chin as if sealing the promise. And for the first time that night, Emily believed they might just beat the storm. The rumble of engines broke through the storm, low and steady, like the promise of salvation. Emily rose from her crouch beneath the rock face, straining to see through the rain that ran in sheets across the ridge. Through the curtain of water, yellow beams of headlights cut swaths of light through the trees. Relief surged in her chest so hard it almost knocked the breath out of her. "They're here!" she shouted, her voice raw with exhaustion. Mark straightened, his shoulders sagging, but his grip firm on Miller. Lisa pressed her hands against the old man's chest, steadying him as his eyes fluttered. Rusty lifted his head, water dripping from his whiskers, and let out a sharp squeak that sounded for all the world like triumph. The first rescuer appeared out of the storm, a helmet lamp shining white through the dark. Behind him came two more, each carrying packs heavy with gear. They rushed forward with the calm urgency of men who had done this 100 times before. "Officer Carter," the leader called. "Here." Emily waved them in. "He's critical. Compound fracture, possible internal bleeding." Conscious but fading, the rescuers knelt at once, opening cases, unfurling blankets, checking vitals. Lisa shifted back to give them room, her hands trembling now that help had arrived. Emily placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You kept him alive. Don't forget that." The team lifted Miller onto a stretcher, securing him with practiced efficiency. Rusty scrambled up with him, refusing to be parted. When one of the rescuers tried to shoo him off, the raccoon bared his teeth and wrapped both arms around Miller's neck like a stubborn child. "Let him stay," Emily said quickly, surprising herself with the force of her voice. "He led us to him. He's not leaving now." The rescuer blinked, then gave a small shrug. "Fine, but he rides low." So they strapped Miller in, and Rusty curled into the crook of his arm, glaring at anyone who came too close. The stretcher lifted. The storm still raged, but the sight of that small animal clinging so fiercely to the man who had raised him struck Emily harder than any thunderclap. The procession wound its way back through the forest. Branches whipped in the wind, mud sucked at boots. But step by step, they moved toward the waiting vehicles. Emily walked beside the stretcher, her flashlight beam steady. At one point, Miller stirred, his hand searching until it found Rusty's fur. His cracked lips moved. "You found them," he whispered hoarsely. "You saved me, boy." Emily bit her lip hard. She felt her eyes burn, the sting she had been holding back all night threatening to spill over. When Rusty pressed his little face against Miller's cheek and let out a soft, almost human whimper, the tears finally came. She tried to hide them, lowering her head as rain mixed with salt, but Lisa saw. She reached out, squeezed Emily's hand briefly. "It's all right," she murmured. "You're not the only one." By the time they reached the vehicles, the storm was breaking. The sky still wept, but the worst of its fury had passed. Miller was loaded into the back of the rescue truck, wrapped in blankets, oxygen mask fitted over his face. Rusty never moved from his side. Emily stepped back, her uniform soaked through, hair plastered to her temples. The relief was overwhelming, and yet her chest ached with something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. She had seen plenty of rescues, plenty of tragedies, but never had she seen an animal demand to be heard so fiercely. Never had she seen devotion that cut through the storm like a beacon. As the truck door shut and the engine roared to life, Rusty's eyes found hers through the window, small, dark, and impossibly bright. She raised her hand without thinking. He pressed his tiny paw against the glass, as if to answer. And that was when the sob broke free. Not a neat tear sliding down her cheek, but a full, unguarded release. She turned away into the rain, shoulders shaking, heart laid bare. She cried not only for the old man clinging to life, but for the stubborn little raccoon who refused to let him die alone. Mark came to stand beside her, silent, the kind of silence that meant respect. Lisa wrapped her arms around herself, tears on her cheeks too, though she smiled faintly. "That little guy," she whispered. "He's going to change the way people see everything." Emily nodded, wiping at her eyes, her voice husky. "He already has." The convoy pulled away, tires hissing against the wet road, carrying Miller and Rusty toward the safety of the hospital lights. The storm faded behind them. The forest sighed, releasing its secret. Emily stood at the roadside, soaked to her bones, heart raw, and watched the taillights disappear into the distance. And in that moment, with tears still warm on her cheeks, she understood something she would never forget. Sometimes the smallest, most unlikely messenger can carry the loudest cry for help. And sometimes it takes a wild little raccoon to remind the world what love and loyalty truly look like. Weeks passed, and the storm that had nearly taken Thomas Miller's life became only a memory, though one etched deeply into the hearts of everyone who had been there. Summer sunlight now lay over Maplewood like a warm quilt, the town slowly shaking off the fear that had hung heavy that night. For Emily, though, the memory was never far. Every time she drove her cruiser past the turnoff for the ridge, she would slow without realizing it, remembering the small, soaked raccoon tapping insistently at her boot. Miller survived. His leg, though battered and broken, had been saved by the surgeons in Denver. Recovery would be long, but he had fought his way back with the same grit that had carried him through years in the woods. When Emily visited him in the hospital the first time, she had been almost nervous. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because of the way he had looked at her in that cabin, desperate but filled with faith in the animal at his side. He greeted her with a frail smile. Rusty sat on the windowsill, nosing at a potted plant, his black mask of fur making him look like a little thief casing the room. But when he saw Emily, he bounded straight to her, claws scrabbling up the blanket, until he was perched proudly on her lap. He smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay, a mix of hospital air and the animal shelter where he stayed at night. Emily laughed in spite of herself, scratching behind his ears. "You see," Miller rasped, pride flickering in his tired eyes. "He remembers. He knows who listened." It was true. Rusty looked up at her with those dark, clever eyes, and she felt again the strange connection she had sensed on the highway. That bridge between wild instinct and something more tender, more knowing. Word of the rescue spread quickly, first in the local papers, then on regional news. By the time Miller returned home, Rusty had become something of a folk hero. People wanted to see him, to hear the story of the raccoon who wouldn't stop until someone followed. Schools wrote letters asking if they could make him their mascot. Families left bags of fruit and dog food outside the wildlife center, hoping he might get a taste. It was Emily who pushed for a more permanent solution. She argued at the town council meeting that Rusty deserved better than to vanish back into the woods where he'd almost been lost. He had become a living lesson, she said, a reminder that compassion reached across species, and that sometimes help came from where you least expected it. And so, on a golden Saturday morning, Maplewood opened the gates to a modest but proud new project, the Wildlife Learning Center. It wasn't grand, just a repurposed barn on the edge of town, with open enclosures, educational displays, and paths winding through shaded pens where injured or orphaned animals could live safely. But the centerpiece, the part everyone came to see, was Rusty. His enclosure wasn't a cage, but a spacious habitat built from logs and climbing poles, with a small pond at the corner and plenty of places for him to hide and play. Children pressed against the glass, squealing with laughter as he tumbled from branch to branch, sometimes hanging upside down by his back legs just to show off. When he grew tired of entertaining, he would trot to the fence, cock his head, and reach out a paw as though offering to shake hands. Emily stood among the crowd at the grand opening, her uniform traded for jeans and a simple shirt. She watched as Miller, still leaning on a cane, stepped up to the microphone. His voice trembled at first, but steadied with each word. "I thought I'd leave this world alone, forgotten in the woods," he said. But a small, stubborn raccoon refused to let that happen. He reminded me that trust and loyalty aren't human inventions. They're part of life itself. Rusty saved me, and in doing so, he saved a part of all of us. The crowd erupted in applause. Rusty, as though sensing his cue, scrambled to the highest perch in his enclosure and raised his head proudly, chittering so loudly it carried across the grounds. Laughter and cheers followed, and for once, Emily didn't fight the tears that welled in her eyes. She let them come, smiling through them. Later, as the crowd dispersed and children tugged on their parents' hands, begging for one more look, Emily walked quietly toward the observation glass. Rusty spotted her immediately. He padded closer, his movements less playful now, more deliberate. He placed one small paw against the glass, right where her hand rested on the other side. For a moment, the noise of the crowd faded, and all she could see were those eyes, dark, intelligent, full of mischief and devotion all at once. She remembered the rain, the wrecked cabin, the sound of him tapping against her cruiser door. She remembered the tears that had broken free when she realized what he had done. and she felt deep down that he was remembering too. "You changed everything, little one," she whispered, her voice catching. "Not just for him, for me too." Rusty blinked slowly, then let out a soft chitter that sounded almost like an answer. He scampered back up his perch, curling into a ball as the afternoon sun warmed his back. Emily lingered a while longer, then finally turned to leave. The center bustled behind her, families laughing, children pointing, hope settling into the small town like sunshine after rain. Rusty had become more than just a survivor. He had become a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest, most unlikely creatures could carry the weight of love, loyalty, and life itself. As she walked back to her car, Emily felt lighter. The tears she had shed on that stormy night had not been in vain. They had been the beginning of something new. And she knew with absolute certainty that every time the world threatened to grow too heavy, she would remember the raccoon who refused to be ignored, and the way he had taught her to listen. In the fading light of that evening, the town of Maplewood stood a little taller, bound by the story of a stubborn little raccoon who had once stopped traffic on a highway and ended up stopping hearts, with wonder, with laughter, and with tears. If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple 1 in the comments so I know you were here. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you'll never miss the next story. And trust me, the next one will move you even more.